Hey there, I'm Steve.
And I'm Whitney, and we're going to talk to you today about managed versus unmanaged clusters in Tanzu Community Edition.
And so before we get started on getting into the details of that, let's go ahead and level set everybody on what are the essential pieces to understand in a Kubernetes cluster before we can talk about managed and unmanaged clusters. So put on your memory cap about Kubernetes. And the two pieces we're really going to divide up and talk about today are one, the control plane, right? So in every Kubernetes cluster, there is a control plane. And when I first started in Kubernetes, these were usually called control plane nodes. Now it's just control plane because in certain architectures, the services that make up the control plane can actually be spread among many machines, many VMs. They can be spread whatever, but those services together, they manage the nodes, which we'll get to in a second, but the control plane manages the nodes and the applications or workloads running on the nodes, right? So that could be your databases as well, your cron jobs, all those things that are running in the nodes are also kept track of in your control plane. So the nodes are actually where you run all of your applications or your databases. That's where all your pods and your containers and all that fun stuff is actually spun up and run. And in this case, to be a node, all nodes have a certain set of services that they have to have. For example, of the kubelet. Every node has to have a kubelet. You can't spread that out across all the different nodes. They have to have these pieces. And that's part of also what makes them a node. Right? So again, control plane manages and controls nodes and also the things running on the nodes, and the worker nodes actually run the things that you want to run for your applications.
So your control plane is managing your worker nodes, and your worker nodes can also just be called nodes, and those are what's running the application.
Exactly. Nice.
So let's talk about what an unmanaged cluster looks like. So an unmanaged cluster is basically a Kubernetes cluster, but it is running on your local machine and it is all encompassed in one container. And it uses a technology called KINDs, which the K stands for Kubernetes, and then in Docker. The D is for Docker, so KIND. So
Fancy.
some benefits, it is, right? Some benefits of this, my favorite is that there are no cloud costs. So this is all running locally and it saves you money that way. It's really fast to tear down and spin up since it's just this one single container. Then after your initial download, you have limited or no internet needed. So that can be, so if you want to practice your kubectl commands on the airplane, you can do that. Um, you also have less resource usage since we only have the one cluster. And then all pieces inside are containers running in this root container. So when you need to clean it up, if you want to make a new one or just get rid of this one, it's a pretty easy thing to do.
Great. And so that is a unmanaged cluster because it's unmanaged and it's nice and simple and lightweight. If we talk now about managed clusters, things get a little bit more hierarchical. So what a managed cluster is you actually spin up a Kubernetes cluster whose sole job in life is to manage other Kubernetes clusters, right? So you'll have a Kubernetes cluster, which will be your management cluster.
So
And
I'm
that has its,
representing the, oh,
go
sorry to
ahead.
interrupt. I'm representing the control plane here and the worker nodes here.
Yep.
I'm not going to be able to label it since it's so small, but this is a cluster
Yes. And
similar to what's
we
here.
believe you that those are two different kinds of uh, pieces running inside that cluster. And
Yes.
so then this cluster, what actually it does is it uses the cluster API, which is part of the Kubernetes project. And the cluster API allows you to actually create custom resource definitions. It has created custom resource definitions for a Kubernetes cluster. So there is a definition for a cluster. There's a definition for a machine. All of these things are part of these resource definitions. And the worker nodes in the management cluster actually manage the creation, deletion, all the management of what we're going to call workload clusters. So these workload clusters are actually a whole nother Kubernetes cluster with a control plane and worker nodes of its own. But in this case, this is much more similar to the unmanaged cluster that we had before, where the control plane is just managing worker nodes and those worker nodes are running your applications, right? And the example here is you can have a managed cluster that's keeping track of the management of multiple workload clusters. So those clusters down below are core workload clusters. So if you want to summarize it in one key phrase, you're using Kubernetes to manage Kubernetes.
Nice.
So some of the benefits you get here, and is one of the reasons we like Kubernetes in the first place, right? Is, I'll let you finish that very important statement. One of the benefits you get here is one of the things we like about Kubernetes in the first place is we move from an imperative style of making infrastructure, something like Ansible or shell scripts or something that like basically says, go do this, and I'm going to wait until you come back and told me you've done this, to a declarative style, right? Which is what Kubernetes does, which is, this is how I want the universe to look, go make it that way. And so this way you can say, I want a Kubernetes cluster that looks like this. And you send that message to the managed cluster, and then you just let it go do its thing. And it's going to spin up a cluster that makes it look the way you want it to look, right? The other nice part is now you have a central storage or central querying location to manage all of your other clusters, right? So you can ask questions of the management cluster that it knows about in all of its clusters that it's managing, right? And because it knows about all those clusters it's managing, and because it spun them up, you can do things like upgrading your cluster is a single command, right? Because it knows all the configuration inside of that workload cluster, and it knows through the custom resource definitions how to upgrade that cluster. But you can also create a cluster with a single command, right? Which is typically not how you have to do it with kubeadm, right? There's a lot involved here, but in here you just say cluster create, and you say what the specs are in a little YAML file, and you'll get a whole cluster, right? One of the other great parts about this, and this is the part that I think I love because it creates a real clear separation of concern, is the ops person can make the management cluster using all the management cluster needs all the cloud credentials, right? It needs to know like your AWS username and SSH key password, all that stuff, or your Azure one, right? Because it is going to go then create other infrastructure in that cloud provider, right? So it needs those credentials, but an end user, as long as they can attach to the management cluster, they can also use kubectl or the Tanzu command line to tell the management cluster, hey, go spin up some other clusters for me without actually knowing the cloud credentials. So it's this nice clear separation of concern where the ops person can say, yeah, you can go manage and it'll all be associated with this management cluster, but I don't have to tell you the username and password, and you can't spin up arbitrary infrastructure in that cloud, right? So to me, that actually is one of the really big benefits of the managed cluster, is that delegation, clear delegation. So I think that covers some of the big, pluses and minuses, or benefits, not minuses actually. We just talked about benefits. Some of the big benefits and trade-offs between the two cluster types. How do you feel about talking about some use cases?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. You want to bring up, how about the production use case? So I'm going over to my computer, I'm getting ready to do a production use case, right? Like we actually want a production cluster. So we're going to need high availability, we're going to need scalability, we're going to need, things to be managed in a much different manner. Where do you think that, would you want to tell people what you think is the right solution on that one?
Well, considering mine is associated with no cloud costs and it's meant to be run locally on your local machine, that's probably not a place you want to be running production workloads.
That's how I feel about it as well, right? Like I think you can, if you like living on the edge of your seat, run it on an unmanaged cluster. There's nothing to stop you from, you could probably figure some way to spin it up somewhere else, but that's not how I would use it. In general, for production, managed is the way to go. Another use case we had talked about is like, what about local development, like doing development work, like quick, rapid development?
Rapid development, that sounds like a job for unmanaged because it's easy to set up, it's easy to clean up. You can run it without, just on your local machine and even without internet after it's set up.
Right. And everything's just kind of going locally on your local loopback
Hmm.
network. There's no like if you're transferring files, it's not a big file transfer. The one drawback though that I've come across with this though is because it's running kind rather than a typical Kubernetes cluster or a more typical type Kubernetes cluster, it's not necessarily a good mirror for
Mm,
what is going to happen in production. Right. So
yeah.
you could do some sort of level of testing, but it's not, I wouldn't say like just chuck it over the wall to ops and say, hey, it ran in my unmanaged cluster. It's good for production.
That's a
Kind of
very good
funny.
point. And one of the 12 factors is that you should keep your different environments as close to the same as possible.
Right. So I think in that case,
Hmm.
we can also say that there is probably a use case for making a managed development cluster, right? Like you're spinning up a managed
Yes.
cluster, but it's for development purposes, but that actually might have more of the CI/CD tool chain in it, those kinds of things where
Uh-huh.
we're getting closer to being ready to go to the next stage, like staging or something like that, right? Speaking of CI/CD, another use case that comes up though is sometimes in your CI/CD tool chain, you actually want to test a container, or you want to see if it even runs in Kubernetes, or you want to do some sort of lightweight
Mm,
testing just to see if this works in Kubernetes at all. So in the
yeah.
CI/CD tool chain, you want to spin up a Kubernetes cluster and tear one down, right?
So
Yeah, go ahead.
it makes a lot of sense to do your first little bit of testing here before you do the work of getting it all up in the cloud and testing it there.
Right. So I think the unmanaged is really good for these situations where you need quick spin up, quick tear down, and it doesn't have to exactly match what the production case is. Another one is how about we talk about running a fleet of clusters. So you're now in charge of running 30 clusters. How do you want to do
Wow. I think if you try to do that unmanaged locally, your laptop would get really hot.
that? That is
You,
true.
it might catch on fire.
Right. That is true. Right. So yeah, and the management cluster also makes that easier just because you have one interface to query that keeps track of it all.
Uh-huh.
Right.
So could you use your management cluster to make your fleet of 30 clusters?
Yeah, that is exactly the use case that you're supposed to be doing, right? Which is
Uh-huh.
you're going to consistently use your management cluster to spin up all 30 at once, right? You can just keep going through some sort of
Mm-hmm.
declaration or something like that. But yes, you could use your management cluster for something like that.
Would it make sense to use your management cluster to make like a identical development, test, and production environments all managed by the management cluster?
Yeah, that's actually one of the stages. When you actually spin up, when you say Tanzu create cluster, which is what it
Mm-hmm.
uses create a workload cluster, you can pass in a YAML file, right? And so basically, what you
Excellent.
could do is you could have three YAML files, each with a different cluster name in them, but all the other
Mm-hmm.
specs are the same. Or you might want to say in the dev spec, the machines aren't as beefy, right? Because you
Mm-hmm.
don't really need to spend as much money. That doesn't speed is not quite as much, or you might not have as
Yep.
many control plane nodes. You might not have as many worker nodes. That stuff, but everything else about the spec is exactly the same, right? So that actually becomes very nice in the management.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
I can see that.
Okay, but suppose I'm new and I just want to learn stuff and I'm just playing around. Like where
What?
I could go to the managed route, but I have a feeling I know where you're going to go with this, Whitney. Where are you going to go? I'm just messing around or just
I
running stuff.
am. That's me. I'm new. I'm playing around, and I have an unmanaged Tandu Community Edition cluster running on my laptop right now.
Right. Because I mean, there's no cost, right? So you don't have to go get
Uh-huh.
approval. You don't have to have any cloud stuff to do it. And if you mess up, right, like it's just delete the cluster, make a new one, start over again. It takes less than 4 minutes to create a new cluster and stuff like that. So I think with that we've
As a
covered.
learner, it's nice to feel safe.
Right, exactly. And also plus you haven't like you haven't messed up your machine, right? Like you haven't created
Hmm.
this tons of
Hmm.
images and filled up your cache because you're just
Hmm.
creating this one little thing, which I think
It's
that's the nice cleanup part.
it's yeah, it's all contains within the root container.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, I think with that, we've covered the big parts of why people might want to go learn more about Tanzu Community Edition managed and unmanaged clusters. Um, I feel super pumped to go play with it some more. I do it all the time, but I still feel super pumped to do some more of it. Anything else you want to? Yes. Anything else you want to finish this up with?
I'm in a hurry now. I'm feeling inspired to go practice my kubectl commands.
on the plane. So,
Yes.
so again, I'm Steve.
And I'm Whitney.
And come join us in the Tanzu. You can find our coordinates if you go to tanzucommunityedition.io/community. There's tons of ways to come join us. And we'd love your feedback on managed and unmanaged clusters or anything else that you have with Tanzu Community Edition. Have a great day.
Bye.